So we wanted to introduce this particular session, which is the 6th in our series on continuous delivery. We're going to have a slightly different orientation here. Other previous sessions had provided an introduction to continuous delivery and also some of the underlying operational, organizational, and technical processes. What we actually wanted to do in this particular session is provide value in guiding your direction by sharing information and insights that we've learned from discussions with other teams and organizations on their evolutionary journey to continuous delivery. So what we'd like to do here is share their perspectives. We believe this will be informative and valuable to you as you go along this path. So in terms of the objectives, really there are two. First is to provide some guidance on the evolution towards continuous delivery. And the basis of this guidance is really the learnings and experiences of a broad range of teams and individuals. And what we'd like to do is share their experiences, provide you their insight, and also enable you to compare your perspectives with respect to what they have found. In terms of a specific agenda, we'll really organize this into two sections. The first section will be to share insights that we've collected from a range of qualitative interviews. These have been about 20 in total. And what we'll do here is discuss the methodology for the interviews, some of their findings, and some of the challenges that the teams found in their continuous delivery migration and evolution. We'll have the opportunity for Q&A and a poll. And then in the second part, what we'll also share is some of the results we've had from a broader, more quantitative online survey. And we'll talk about some of the findings there. And again, give you an opportunity to ask questions and also a poll to really understand your perspectives. Good. Let me first start out with the qualitative interviews. These were a total of about 20 companies. The way we structured those was as in-person interviews. They were typically about an hour, hour and a half long. These were with teams that had a self-declared interest and a commitment to continuous delivery. They had identified themselves as having that interest. In many cases, they had actually adopted continuous delivery practices or were in the process of implementing in-house solutions to address delivery issues. The second part of the survey, which is the online survey, really came from a set of developers who had identified interest in continuous delivery from the DZone website. And so what we did was we polled them on their perspectives and some of their underlying attributes in terms of frequency of release, timing of release. And we'll get to those results in a few minutes. So let me start out with the objectives of the interview. Really, we had four objectives. First objective was really to understand the motivation and what drove these organizations in moving to continuous delivery. Was it time to market? Was it mitigating risk? Were there some other factors? Really wanted to understand the motivations here. Second point we wanted to gain was an insight into what was their current delivery process. What were some of their current practices? How did they feel that those practices were inhibiting their evolution? And get a better understanding of the baseline of their process before they actually embarked on a continuous delivery journey. We then got into some of the specific issues and pain points that were related in developing a continuous delivery capability. And we also wanted to understand their priorities for changing their software delivery process and also what they did in deployment. So just to give you some background on these participants, they came from a range of industries. So they were from airlines, financial services, all the way to online comparison sites and social gaming. And the common theme among all of these is that the online business was a significant proportion of their revenue. Many of them faced significant competitive pressures in providing functionality that exceeded or matched their competitors. And they were all typically driven by a need to have accelerated time to market and a need to keep competitive pace and release functionality on a very rapid rate. And as I said, typically they were all either online businesses or online divisions of traditional businesses. So first thing we wanted to take a look at is, from the point of view of those companies and those teams, where did they really see the problem scale in terms of adopting a continuous delivery solution? So the way to read this chart is the scale ranges from an unrecognized need on the left. They had the problem, or we made the assessment that they had the problem, but they didn't really see the problem or couldn't describe it. In the middle of the chart, we have what we call an identified solution. They understood the problem, identified the need, but really were in the process of identifying a solution and how they could address their issues. And the next one was really an in-house solution. They had started to develop a custom-developed capability. They were looking to create an in-house tool set, internal teams developing this functionality. And the last was really the adoption of commercial solution. So as you can see, most of these organizations had, all of them had at a minimum identified the solution. Many of them had started to build an in-house tool set to address those issues. And actually, several of them had actually even adopted a commercial solution. This was self-selection, and really on the basis of looking at teams and organizations that wanted to move to continuous delivery, it's not surprising. But we did want to disclose it so we understood this was not in any way representative of the broad set of companies out there. As an example, so we just thought we'd give you an example of what we considered to be one of our participants who was very evolved and very mature in terms of their continuous delivery capability. This was an online retailer in the UK, and they had an interesting characteristic and pattern. So, for example, they had a very high volume of releases. They, in fact, had over 200 per quarter. In some quarters, it had actually gone up to about 250 releases into production per quarter. Obviously, not all of them were high functionality. There was a range of high, medium, and low functionality, but they did have that number of production releases per quarter. The very interesting insight was that they had a very high success rate and were very mature in their continuous delivery deployment. They mentioned they were successful over 90% of the time, meaning that they did not have to roll back more than 10% of their releases. And from our experience, this is a very, very high success rate and is indicative of a very mature team. The other interesting characteristic they had was that they actually had the operations team get directly involved with the development team all the way from project inception. Depending on the complexity and scope of the project, they could be right at the inception of the project or in the middle of the development of the project. But they did have very strong engagement with the operations team. When we asked them what were the biggest challenges that they faced, their perspective was really in terms of alignment with the business. The point of view was that the development teams practiced Agile. The operation teams were comfortable practicing continuous delivery. Their big challenge was that the business teams really didn't think Agile. They thought waterfall. And so the model of the business teams was do business analysis, present requirements, and then expect to see a website with that underlying functionality to meet user requirements get developed in several months. They weren't thinking in terms of an iterative approach, in terms of testing iteratively with their customers. And this was an interesting aspect in terms of what they saw as the biggest challenge. Was somewhat of a surprise to us. So we thought we'd just take a quick couple of minutes here and ask you for your feedback. We wanted you to take a look at all these 4 options and really give us your feedback on what is your primary motivation within your team or organization in terms of moving to continuous delivery. So Risha, if you could just open up the survey for a couple of minutes, let's collect responses and then we can share the results with the team. Good, I trust that you can see all the results here. This is interesting and is actually different from the poll results we got earlier this morning. And just to communicate here, it's the number one factor was in terms of accelerating time to market, as well as faster feedback from the business. So those were the top 2. This was actually fairly consistent with what we expected going into our customer survey. The one thing that we found surprising, and about 20% of you agree with this, is this issue of mitigating release risk. This was an interesting perspective that we had not really realized, which was that for many teams, actually mitigating a release risk is a significant rationale or underlying reason for moving to continuous delivery, more so than accelerating time to market. So it's an interesting result. I think it collaborates with some of our findings, but is different from our initial perspectives. Good, so let me move on and talk about the further set of questions that we asked, which was really to understand what were the challenges that these teams found when they were developing their continuous delivery capability. So if you look at the chart, there were a range of factors, and for many teams, they had multiple issues and challenges they were facing with. By far, the most common factor was this issue of business and operations engagement, and the lack of effective engagement was an inhibitor that they felt had delayed their migration to continuous delivery. On the other end of the spectrum was the lack of continuous integration. And not many teams indicated this, but the issue there is that they still had practices of long-lived branches. They were evolving to continuous integration, and they felt that was a prerequisite organizational behavior before they actually got to a mature continuous delivery capability. So what we'll do now is actually look at each of these factors one by one and share some interesting insights and perspectives. So let's take the first one, which is really the challenge of having effective engagement with business and operations. So some of the symptoms of this was that what they typically found was that business teams really didn't share an agile perspective or an iterative perspective. A second symptom was that they found business teams were not proactive in providing rigorous acceptance test criteria. And they also felt that there was an organizational divide or a barrier between the development and operation teams. They were not as closely integrated. They did not come to the same set of meetings and exhibited really behaviors which showed they were not integrated. So what we would say on this one is that this is a pretty common practice in companies. It's probably a common reason why many agile projects fails. And really what we believe as a core philosophy is that agile projects really cannot succeed in providing business benefits without effective business involvement. It's really indicative of a lack of agile thinking, not really necessarily continuous delivery. What we've also seen, though, is that in cases where there is this lack of effective engagement, continuous delivery practices provide some benefit in terms of reducing the release risk. What they don't do is really provide the larger benefits in terms of accelerated time to market, faster feedback, the ability to rapidly validate a business plan. The second aspect or problem that teams indicated was really a lack of or insufficient or poor build and deployment automation. So some of the symptoms here was packaging and promotion across environments was a challenge. Several organizations believed that provisioning of production-like environments was a major roadblock and obstacle. In fact, one particular team told us the challenge here was that they were not given access, as a development team, they were not given access to production systems, and so obviously could not provision production environments. And what we also found is that during the test process, when the development teams wanted to test in production-like environments, they really were unable to replicate the production environment configurations and were inhibited in their ability to carry out rigorous acceptance testing. We've seen this as a big problem, and our diagnosis for this is that it's really a lack of trust between development and operations teams. Right, one of the root causes of this problem is that operations teams often treat deployment configurations as works of art. What this could mean is that there's poor documentation of scripts needed to replicate production environments. Knowledge may exist as ad hoc documents, for example, post-it notes. This knowledge may be in the heads of key personnel. Another trust issue is that operations teams sometimes do not want to even provide configuration knowledge to dev. Our suggestion or recommendation here is that a very good practice is to start to get the operation teams to store configuration information in a source code repository, placed under version control, and then enable dev teams to get access to this on a read-only in a read-only mode, so that they can recreate production-like environments. Right? So one of the benefits to this approach is that, in principle, a production environment can be recreatable from bare metal systems. And what this means is that it mitigates the impact of a production failure. Right? So any type of failure can be quickly mitigated, and this ultimately leads to benefits in terms of reliable and resilient systems. So an interesting example that I found in doing my research is that if you look at Netflix, they actually have an internal utility which they use, and they've written about this in their official company blog, which is they have this utility called Chaos Monkey, whose primary purpose is actually to fail systems. And their viewpoint is that by deliberately failing systems, they're testing the resiliency of their overall deployment architecture, and the rapid internal testing is actually enabling them to have a more robust and reliable infrastructure. So I thought that was an interesting perspective, and you can certainly go to the Netflix corporate blog and read about it. Right, so the next issue is really in terms of lack of automated testing. Right, and what we find here is that, as we all know, automated testing is very complementary to manual acceptance testing. The problem is that the higher degree of manual testing that you have, it actually delays cycle time and ultimately inhibits your ability to do fast deployments. The other big challenge that we found is that in many teams, it's difficult to keep synchronized between the automated tests and what is done in development. So classic problem we're all aware of, there'll be a new piece of functionality developed, the automated test doesn't match, and there's an issue. So one of the things that my colleague Jez Humble says is that there are really 4 key points to creating maintainable end-to-end or acceptance tests. His first recommendation is to make sure that tests are layered, right? Separate out the test implementation layer, which could be written in domain objects that are specific to the test harness, from the application driver layer, which does all the point-click validation. Second recommendation is to write scenario test suites, not just on a per-story basis, right? And his argument here is that every time you play a new scenario, what you should be doing is really differencing the scenario tests rather than just adding a new suite of tests. So therefore, you make sure that the end-to-end scenario test always represents the higher value end-user scenarios. His third recommendation is to make sure that there's collaboration between dev and QA on the creation and maintenance of tests. And last one is really not to tolerate flaky tests or unreliable tests. Next major challenge that we found, and I think this relates to one of the questions that we got earlier also, was really this notion of having a legacy monolithic application architecture that inhibits rapid cycle times. And the typical scenario there is that legacy application can be very difficult to rebuild. Changes take a long time to go through the build, through the integration build, and testing cycle. And the question is, how do you handle that? And the complaint that we hear fairly consistently is that refactoring a legacy monolithic application into something that is more services-oriented is a lot of work. Unfortunately, we don't see any way around this, right? It's a substantial, but it's a critical investment to be able to go from a monolithic to a more services-oriented approach. An interesting perspective here is from Steve Yegi's blog. So Steve was a former employee of Amazon, currently employed by Google, and he had written a fairly well-circulated blog post about this on his experiences at Amazon. This was about 2002. And they had a top-down executive-level directive to move to a services-oriented architecture. So according to him, there was a CEO-level mandate. There were several characteristics of the mandate. One was that all teams had to do this. There were no exceptions. That the teams would need to expose all the data and functionality through services interfaces. That internally, this was the only way that teams were allowed to communicate. There could be no inter-process communication, no backdoors, no data store, no shared data store, no shared memory. And really, it was a mandate for all teams to do this, no exceptions allowed. So as we all know, this was a very successful. Amazon was able to transition, from a online retailer to a web services company, but it did take several years. It was a very significant effort, and also problem and challenge was that it was a top-down directive. So I think our experience here is that yes, it can be done, but I think management teams need to sign up to the investment and also need to be prepared for it to take several years and to really maintain that commitment. I wanted to touch on a couple of other things before we get to a poll and Q&A. The other challenge we discussed was really one of continuous integration, moving away from long-lived branches and moving to mainline development. I think this is something that is pretty well understood in the industry. Continuous integration is a well-established practice. Really the issue is adopting the practice internally. Rollbacks are a symptom of another major set of problems. In fact, many teams have indicated there are challenges in doing automated rollbacks. What we would suggest there is really to think about mitigation techniques, using canary releases, where you make a release available to a small subset of your users and or do a fix and roll forward. In fact, we found some very leading edge development teams really de-emphasize testing. What they really emphasize is extensive production monitoring, identifying issues, and then rapid correction and deployment. The issue with respect to database rollback is significant, and we don't minimize that. There are a couple of suggestions again here. One is versioning the database and using a tool like dbdeploy to manage migrations automatically. And secondly, to strive to maintain forward and backward compatibility with schema changes so that you can separate the data deployment and the migration issues from application deployment. And again, my colleague Jez Humble talks about this in his book, Continuous Delivery. So I thought we could take a break for a couple of minutes here at this point. And while we're entertaining some Q&A, actually wanted to throw up another poll, which is to really ask you, from all the various issues that you've heard of, the 6 issues, what would you rate as the most significant inhibitor? And while we're giving you a couple of minutes to fill out the poll, good. So I hope you can all see the results of the poll here. So in terms of the specific factors, this is actually fairly consistent among all the teams that we've polled, is that the lack of cultural change and engagement with business and operations is the biggest factor. And in this poll results, we find it's the #1 factor. Automated testing here comes up as a significant factor as well, and monolithic applications. So this is actually fairly remarkable. In every scenario where we've run this test, and you'll actually look at our quantitative tests in a few minutes, this comes back as a fairly consistent pattern where automated acceptance testing, cultural change, and monolithic applications wind up being the big inhibitors. And in fact, in this case, it would represent roughly of about half of the issues. Good, thank you very much for that feedback. Let me actually get to the next part of the discussion, which is really to talk about the online survey. We'll go through this section fairly quickly. Just in terms of full disclosure on how we got the data, this all came from the DZone website. We got approximately 400 responses. The total population that we tested was about 13,000, so this is about a 6% response rate. Really, there was no offer here. The only offer here was in terms of sharing the results. So we feel it was a pretty unbiased set of responses. And the interesting aspects of this is that roughly 75%, right, 3/4 of the participants agreed that internet-facing applications were a significant part of their business. And slightly over 2/3, about 70%, identified their role as application development. So think of this as really representing development teams in a lot of online businesses, would be the most common pattern. So the first survey question we had was in terms of the frequency of production releases. And here what we found is that roughly 60% of the respondents indicated that their releases were monthly or more frequently. So that's fairly typical of what we've seen in online businesses. In many cases, there was actually a significant proportion of them that did multiple releases per week. And we find that this is not uncommon. Some of the other survey participants in our qualitative survey actually were doing 4 production release cycles a week. And so this is not unusual. Next question we had was really in terms of the desire to increase release frequency. And again here about 60% said that they wanted to increase or accelerate the release frequency. So even though they were doing things fairly quickly, they still wanted to accelerate. And I think this is very indicative of time to market pressures that a lot of these teams face. So our final question here, and I apologize for this slide being a little bit dense and hard to read, but the question here was, what were the top issues and frustrations that teams had with the current release process? And so, interestingly enough, the top three factors were lack of automated testing, the challenges of provisioning environments, and also poor collaboration with the business. So I think this is actually a very good collaboration for what your perspective was from the audience, and again reflects the fairly consistent theme we've seen around this. This was actually a big surprise to us in this study, was this lack of business and operations engagement. And we had never recognized the significance or the magnitude of the issue until we actually conducted the study. So that's pretty much all that we had in terms of content. We did have a couple of requests to make. One request is, first of all, to help us understand your perspective a little bit more by filling out this next poll question and giving us an indication of which statements you would agree with on this list. And while we're doing this, we can keep things open for a couple of minutes more in terms of Q&A. And then we'll share with you the poll results and we can conclude the webinar. So Risha, if you can just keep this open for a couple of minutes. In the meantime, we can take additional questions. Right, so I think a couple of them had come in on email. Risha? Yes, so in this survey, no, we did not have any experience with any non-web-based teams. I think it was similar to another question we had regarding the use of continuous delivery for embedded applications and devices. So honestly, we didn't have any rigorous interviews with those type of embedded systems or non-web-based businesses. In general, though, we've had discussions with several customers who are in that category of business, and as I said, their application release cycles tend to be more often driven by other factors other than a need to get to market. So for example, in some cases it might be regulatory. For example, many accounting applications typically released once a year because that's when accounting year ends, right? So typically you finish the accounting year, you close out your books, and then you upgrade to the next version of the accounting software. And as I said, in terms of embedded systems, what you also find is that it is driven by the hardware release cycle. And so there's really the constraint of getting the software ready on a particular timeline and not having the flexibility to release continuously. Yeah, this is an interesting one. And we've talked to several teams that had gone through this. And depending on the complexity of application, this can actually take a couple of years. And we found it's not uncommon for that. It's a fairly dramatic change in mindset, right? To go in terms of having the luxury of having long-lived feature branches, being able to build out your functionality on a branch, test it, and then have the flexibility to release independently of the mainline. Moving from that to one where you're continuously integrating and doing that on a daily basis. So our chief scientist, Martin Fowler, talks about his definition of continuous delivery, or one of the aspects of it as being daily integrations. And so this notion of going from monthly or multiple month long feature branches to daily integrations is a big behavioral change. And what we found, it can typically take 2 to 3 years. Very good. So in terms, thank you very much. So in terms of the people that had responded, it looks like the most characteristic pattern here is a need for automated provisioning of environments. That came out the most common in about a third. What we found was that about a quarter of the 26%, about a quarter of the teams had release cycles that were longer than 12 weeks. Only a small proportion of those wanted to actually reduce that. So it's an interesting perspective here. Good engagement with the business partners, again, a minority. This is not surprising based on our previous results. And again, from this team, it looks like there's only about 18% that actually practice continuous integration. So it looks like we actually have a couple of questions here. And this one of the questions is, what's the best source code system for CI, distributed or centralized? Unfortunately, I think the best answer here is it depends. There are the obvious challenges with distributed source code control. Really, in terms of worldwide geographic distribution, it's a big challenge, right? And there are some alternative tools that we are familiar with, for mirroring on those. Let me follow up with you an email on those. The other question that came in was observations for challenges caused by dependencies on other vendors, components, libraries, database. Yeah, this is a big issue, and in fact, if you read Jez's book, there are challenges here in terms of how do you incorporate additional libraries. I think it's really indicative of needing a very good artifact repository where you can manage this effectively, making sure that all of your components are leveraging the same set of libraries. And in fact, Jez has quite a bit of commentary on this on his book. So not to plug the book too extensively, but I think you'll find some very good content in that book. And it's pretty well regarded and well read on that topic. So good. If there are no more questions, I wanted to thank everybody for their participation. If you do have any follow-up questions, please send them to Risha. And what we'll do is any of the questions we weren't able to fully answer verbally, what we'll do is just follow up with those online. So thanks again, and thank you, Risha.